Hey everyone, this is Dr. Hips, and I wanted to walk you through an overview of the legislative branch. So, we'll talk a little bit about what the legislative branch is, the various components of the legislative branch, what it is that Congress does, and a little bit about the makeup of Congress. So, the first thing to understand is that Congress is pretty unpopular. You can see from this graphic that the favorability ratings of Congress are remarkably low. They hover around 15 to single digits in modern America. Now, the origins of the legislative branch are important. We have a bicameral legislature. Bi means two, cameral means chamber or house. So we have a two chamber legislature. That means in the American context, we have a US Senate where each state has a fixed number of representatives, which is two, and we have a House of Representatives, which is based on proportional representation or the number of representatives increase as your overall state population increases. The current makeup of our legislature is a Republican controlled Senate and a Republican controlled House of Representatives. That means that the entire lawmaking process is currently controlled by Republicans. Now, to be clear, that does not mean that Democrats don't influence the process, but it does mean that in the current configuration of Congress, Republicans have almost all of the lawmaking power. So they can suggest laws, they can push laws through without a single Democratic vote and have them make it to the president's desk. And the opposite would be true if Democrats controlled the House of Representatives and the Senate. So let's start off by talking about the House of Representatives. This is the chamber that is based on proportional representation, or as population increases, the number of representatives increase. They currently serve 2-year terms of office, and the qualifications are that you have to be at least 25 years old, a citizen of the United States for 7 years. Notice it's a bit different from the president in that presidents have to be natural born citizens, while members of Congress can be naturalized citizens, meaning that they can be born in a different country, and as long as they have obtained citizenship, then they are able to run for congressional office. They also need to be a resident of the state that they are running in. So if you are running in the state of Georgia, you have to live or have a residence in the state of Georgia. The most powerful member of the House of Representatives is the Speaker of the House. And the Speaker of the House presides over the entirety of the House of Representatives. And it's a critically important position because they have a ton of power when it comes to the bills that are considered by Congress. A couple of important notes about the powers of the House of Representatives. So the House is known as the lower chamber of Congress. There are 435 members, and as I mentioned before, they are apportioned or doled out based on state population. They're elected every 2 years. As part of the legislative branch, the initiates revenue legislation. We call them appropriations, so any spending bills. They initiate impeachment proceedings, and they elect the president if no other candidate wins the Electoral College. Now, as I mentioned before, as of a few days ago, Republicans control Congress, and thus they control the day-to-day legislative agenda. The idea of the House is that it was created to be more closely responsive to the people. It represents local district interests rather than statewide interests. So, because there are more representatives, they represent smaller pockets of people. So, for example, in Georgia, up until her resignation, Marjorie Taylor Greene represented a district that included Whitfield County and Murray County and Calhoun and some of those places, whereas John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, who represent the entire state, have to speak on behalf of all 8 million people who live in the state of Georgia. So representatives are intended to be more responsive to the needs of the public. So as I mentioned, these seats are sort of apportioned or handed out based on census data that occurs every 10 years. So every state has at least one representative, and there are also non-voting delegates, so they are part of the overall makeup of Congress, but they're not able to vote, from DC and all of the U.S. territories. So that includes Puerto Rico, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Northern Mariana Islands. All right, moving on to the Senate. The Senate is a bit more formal. They serve 6-year terms, and you have to be at least 30 years old, a citizen of the U.S. for at least 9 years, and a resident of the state that you wish to represent. The Senate is often referred to as the upper chamber of Congress, and the idea is that they provide equal representation for all of the states, regardless of how large population-wise that state is. Right now, the current makeup is that Republicans hold 53 seats, Democrats hold 45, and there are 2 independents who caucus or sort of vote with the Democrats. Right now, the majority leader is John Thune, who is a Republican from South Dakota. The minority leader is Chuck Schumer, who is a Democrat from New York. The current president of the Senate is always the vice president, so that's J.D. Vance, who's a Republican, and the president pro temp, who is the longest tenured member of the majority party, is Chuck Grassley, who is a Republican from Iowa. The Senate has a couple unique roles. And one of the main purposes that they serve is that they engage as a check on other branches of government. So they provide advice and consent. It has to approve all presidential nominations for the cabinet, federal judges, and ambassadors, but that is a simple majority. So the party that's in power can, for the most part, get anyone approved that they wish to get approved. They're also in charge of treaty ratification. So any international treaty requires a 2/3 majority vote by the Senate. The House of Representatives impeaches officials, but the Senate has the exclusive power to conduct the trial and decide on conviction. So it requires 2/3 of the Senate to remove someone who has been impeached. That's why historically, even though we have impeached 3 presidents, none of them have been removed from office. And the Senate provides a little bit more continuity in that there's only about 1/3 of the seats are up for re-election every 2 years, meaning it has a more permanent or long-term membership than the House of Representatives. Now, whether it's the House or the Senate, congressional committees are sort of these smaller specialized groups in Congress that handle a majority of the legislative work. They tend to focus on specific policy areas like agriculture or defense or finance, and they review legislation, conduct oversight of executive agencies, hold hearings to gather information and investigate issues, and they ultimately decide which bills get voted on by the full House or Senate. A couple key functions of congressional committees include what we call drafting of legislation. So they review, amend, and mark up or sort of adjust laws before they're reported to the floor. They also monitor the executive branch to make sure that they are implementing laws appropriately. They manage agency funding, so all agencies are funded by Congress, and they investigate allegations of wrongdoing. They can hold hearings that help them gather information from experts, officials, and the public that help them to shape policy that they may create. Committees also allow members of Congress to develop expertise in specific policy areas. Remember, it's really, really hard to expect a member of Congress to be an expert in every area that they might encounter in their sort of daily work as a member of Congress. Finally, committees help them to filter bills, helping them to decide which proposed bills, remember there are thousands and thousands of them, receive consideration and then potentially become the law. There are three committee types that are really critical to understand: standing, joint, and select. The easiest way to think about it is that standing committees are permanent committees. They exist regardless of who has power in Congress or who the president is. Joint committees have members from both the House and the Senate, and they tend to be concerned with specific policy areas. Finally, select committees are temporary investigative committees. So their primary job is to investigate something, and then once they have written the report, they tend to disband. Another important component of sort of congressional power is reapportionment. Reapportionment is the redistribution of the 435 seats in the U.S. House amongst the 50 states every 10 years. All right, so as the population changes and we conduct the census, we adjust the number of representatives based on the population that a state has gained or lost. So key sort of aspects, one are we want to make sure that it's one person, one vote. So we want to make sure that we are reflecting changes in the way that population is distributed across the country. We do this by following the decennial census, so that's the 10-year census. We have this mathematical formula. It's not important, but it's called the Huntington Hill method. It's used to calculate how many of the 435 seats each state receives. So the next one will happen in 2030. But what we have seen happening more and more and more is that states are starting to engage in what we call off-year redistricting. This is where they are redrawing the maps, not as a result of the Senate or of the census, but more as a political tool to try to ensure that their parties have more political power. So reapportionment is that how many seats every state gets. Reapportionment is about how the total number of representatives that you have. Redistricting happens on a state level, and that is how they draw the districts in ways that reflect those population changes. So again, just to put a fine point on this, reapportionment is about the total number. Redistricting is about how you draw the lines. The impact of reapportionment is really, really critical because as states are increasing in population, so Texas is gaining population while California is losing population, this could have a significant impact on the way that presidential elections sort of play themselves out. We also then have to talk about gerrymandering. So we talked about how redistricting is about redrawing those lines, but gerrymandering is the deliberate manipulation of voting district boundaries to give one political party or group an unfair advantage over another. Now, you can do this in two main ways. You can either pack opposing voters into a few districts or crack them, which means breaking them up across a bunch of districts. Both of those are intended to dilute the power of the minority party. Basically, the party that's in power tries to draw the lines in ways that minimize the power of that minority party. So, if we're talking about the current political climate, where Republicans control a bunch of state legislatures and the White House, they want to draw lines to ensure that Republicans are going to be able to keep and stay in power. Now, to be perfectly transparent, Democrats would do the same thing if they were in power. They would redraw those lines in ways that tried to give Democrats the advantage. We're seeing this play out in Texas. We're seeing it play out in Virginia, in Florida. So this is definitely something we want to pay attention to. This graphic shows sort of that idea of how you can take a district that has 60% orange and 40% purple, and if you're trying to be fair and equitable, there should be 3 orange districts and 2 purple districts, right? That mirrors the population. But depending on how you draw the lines, you can either create 5 orange districts and shut purple out altogether, or pack all of those orange voters into 2 districts and then give purple 3 districts and orange 2. Depending on how you draw the lines, you can either give the majority party a bunch of power, or you can dilute the majority's power to the point that they become the minority. All right, a quick conversation about the membership of Congress. And I'm not going to read you everything that's on the slides, but I want to make a couple points that I do think are important. So you can see the legislative calendar, and Congress is in session most months, but they do have a pretty favorable schedule in terms of their time off. They're also compensated pretty well. The average member of Congress makes about $170,000 a year. Now, that varies depending on the state and the person, but it is a pretty good living, and Congress has the power to raise its own salary. Now, they haven't taken advantage of that since 2009, really when the economy went bad in the recession. Congress realized the optics of giving themselves a raise would be pretty bad in a country where people were struggling financially, and they just have not given themselves a raise since. Now, they have started to talk more publicly about it, how their wages are not keeping up with inflation, but that tends to not be something the public is overly sympathetic to, because everybody is kind of struggling to keep up with inflation. You can also see there's lots of financial benefits that they have. So they have some financial perks in terms of their office spaces and funding their travel and those types of things. There are also some legal protections that come into play. So they are protected against, civil suits for things that they may say or do while they're carrying out their duties. So if they were to, for example, slander one of their colleagues, but it happened during a speech on the floor debating a bill, that would be protected because they were carrying out their official duties. They typically cannot be arrested for minor infractions while Congress is in session, and they're prohibited from holding multiple political offices at the same time. So you can't be a mayor and a congressman, or you can't be a senator and the vice president. Additionally, the diversity of Congress has been a focal point for quite some time. And although Congress is more diverse than it has ever been, both racially, gender wise, religious sort of overtones are more varied than they've been in the past, Congress still trends whiter, older, and more educated than the general population. And a couple visuals that kind of bear that out. So we can see there is more racial diversity than there's been. You can see the numbers for Black voters or Black representatives, for Hispanic representatives, for Asian representatives, and for Native American representatives has sort of increased over time. However, they still are significantly in the minority. So if you kind of do quick math, that's about 150-ish members of Congress that are people of color. There are 535 members of Congress total. So you're still talking about 20% of Congress being minorities, when the country is probably closer to 40 to 45% minority folks. Additionally, there's not a ton of age diversity. You can see there are as many members over the age of 90 as there are under the age of 30. And so that age gap is significant. Now, all of this matters not because a lawmaking or decision-making body inherently makes better decisions because you have Black people or women or gay people or people with disabilities or younger people or whatever it may be. But there is a fair question about, does representation in the conversations affect the potential outcomes? So are you more likely to come to a different set of outcomes if you are asking a more diverse and varied group of people a question? So it isn't necessarily about would a black person make it better, or would a white person make it better, or would a woman make it better, or would a trans person make it better? But it is a question of, if those folks have a voice at the table, are we likely to come up with potential solutions that reflect broader viewpoints than the ones that we currently have, right? So when people ask the question, should Congress look more like the country looks, it's not necessarily a question of, is every color in the crayon box represented, as it is, there are lots of diverse viewpoints, and sometimes those viewpoints are reflective of race or gender or whatever it may be. But how do we get more diverse viewpoints into the conversation so that we are making more educated guesses about the policies that would best support those groups of people? All right, last thing we're going to talk about is sort of the four major roles of Congress. So Congress has four broad jobs that they're supposed to do. Obviously, there's some nuance and detail within each of these, but we're going to try to cover it at a pretty high level. So lawmaking, representation, oversight, and constituency service. And we're going to talk about each one of those in a little more detail. We'll start off with the lawmaking function. I'm going to recommend that you watch Schoolhouse Rock's I'm Just a Bill. It is a wonderful overview of how a bill becomes a law, but I want to make sure that we take a little time to talk about that process in lawmaking more broadly. So Congress, as the key sort of entity within the legislative branch, has the primary constitutional responsibility to create, amend, and pass laws. It really functions as the voice of the people. And so, because it is a bicameral or two-chamber body, both have to approve identical legislation. This means that both play a role in drafting, committee review, and voting on bills. So first, the sort of way to kind of think about it is, the key idea is that you need both the House and the Senate to pass identical versions of a bill. And so in discussing sort of how that process works, again, although Schoolhouse Rocks does it beautifully, I'm going to give you like a quick overview of that process. So a bill becomes law by being introduced in either the House or the Senate. It passes through committee review and hearings. It undergoes floor debate and voting, and then finally is signed by the president, or some other action is taken by the president. So here's how that process works. So first, a bill is sponsored by a member of Congress, either in the House or the Senate, and it's assigned a number. The bill is then referred to a subcommittee, so usually a smaller group within a larger committee. It is studied, debated, and amended if needed. If it is approved, it is reported to the entire House or the entire Senate. All right. If it is not approved, it dies there. The bill just sort of goes away. It has to be reintroduced to be reconsidered. If it goes to the full House or Senate, the bill is debated on the floor, amendments can be added, and a final vote is taken. If that bill is passed, the bill moves to the other chamber. So if it started in the House, it moves to the Senate. If it started in the Senate, it moves to the House. All right, it goes through the same committee and voting process. In the event that the House and Senate pass different versions of a bill, they form what's known as a conference committee. This is comprised of members from both the House and the Senate, and their job is to reconcile or kind of fix the differences between the two bills. Both chambers have to vote on the final reconciled version. So any changes that are made by that conference committee are voted on in both the House and the Senate. If it is approved, it then goes to the president. The president has 10 days to, one, sign the bill, in which it becomes law, veto the bill, or cancel the bill, which then the bill goes back to Congress, or the president can take no action. And if the president decides to do nothing, if Congress is in session after 10 days, if the president has done nothing, it becomes law. If Congress is not in session and 10 days pass and the president has done nothing, then the bill is vetoed. Now, why would this be the way that it worked? Well, let's imagine a scenario where the president has promised during their campaign or at some other point not to vote for a bill. Right? He's not gonna sign a bill. But there's a lot of public pressure for him to do so. So maybe what he does is he sort of does nothing, Congress adjourns, and then the bill is vetoed, and he can sort of blame it on the timing of Congress, right? It allows the president to sort of get away with vetoing a bill without having to be proactively doing it. So he gets the outcome he wants without having to be the person who actually does the thing, if that makes sense. Once a bill is passed by the president, it is recorded as public law by the Office of the Federal Register, and it becomes law that needs to now be followed. All right, the second job of Congress's representation. The representative function of Congress ensures that the will, interests, and needs of the American people have a voice and they're addressed in federal lawmaking. Members act as advocates for their specific district in the House or state in the Senate, and they try to balance local constituent concerns with national interests, right? So what you always have to remember is that every district, every town, every county exists in the broader tapestry of their state and in the even broader context of the country. So even if something is good, let's say for Dalton, it might not be good for Whitfield County. Or if it's good for Whitfield County, it might not be good for the state of Georgia. Or if it's good for Georgia, it might not be good for the country. So Congress people have to constantly balance the needs of their local constituencies with the broader needs of the state and the country. This means that Congress people have to figure out ways to represent their public, and they can do so in a couple ways. So you can use the trustee model where members have to vote based on their own judgment and preferences, or the delegate model, which says that they need to follow their constituents. They need to do what their voters want them to do, even if they personally disagree. How ultimately a congressperson decides to adjust and involve themselves in this process really has an impact on how the public views them and overall how effective their representation is. Third is oversight. One of the major jobs is to make sure that other branches of government are doing the things that they are supposed to do. And this oversight function is so critically important because if no one is watching the government, then people within government are able to act with impunity with no threat of consequences or punishment when they're not following the law in the way that they are supposed to. Finally, is constituency service. Constituent service function of Congress involves non-legislative activity, so they're not making law, but members and staff act as sort of go-betweens between the citizens and federal agencies. So this is, folks handling issues within agencies like Social Security or Veterans Affairs, facilitating federal grants that get money for their local communities, conducting site visits. And so they do this in a couple of ways. First, members of Congress or their staffs can make inquiries to government agencies on behalf of their voters. So they can try to get a prompt response from a certain agency and help people kind of navigate the federal bureaucracy. This happens, so let's say that you live in a district that has a lot of veterans, and so you sort of make a request that Veterans Affairs moves more quickly on trying to get them resources or maybe medical care that they need. There are also grants and projects. So offices of Congresspeople tend to help local governments, nonprofits, and businesses identify and apply for grants. There are also opportunities for service where members facilitate opportunities for their constituents. So there are Capitol tours on a state level. We see a lot of times where state representatives have high school kids or college kids come in to tour the Capitol. There are academy nominations. So if you are going to go to a service academy, you have to get a nomination from a congressperson. And finally, they often provide recognition or congratulations for significant achievements. So they show up at graduations, they show up at Eagle Scout ceremonies. Another key component is representing sort of their smaller populations, right? Like making sure they're going home and doing the things that they need to do. Marjorie Taylor Greene, whatever your sort of thoughts about her politically, did a pretty good job of championing the interests of like Dalton State College, for example. And so she was able to represent the college because that was in her district and she needed and was obligated to do good for that entity. So that's an overview of Congress. It's not everything, but I think it provides a pretty strong lesson in how the process of Congress works. As always, I urge you to go through the PowerPoint on your own, watch the videos that are embedded in that PowerPoint. The textbook, which is OpenStax, is a good resource to help provide some more context. And as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. All right, thanks, and have a good one.